Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing my take on a new commander from Theros Beyond Death, Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to that down in the description too. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Kroxa is a 6/6 Elder Giant for 1 black and 1 red. That might seem ridiculously broken, but if it entered the battlefield without having escaped, you have to sacrifice it. This clause can be bypassed by an early game Torpor Orb, but that's not the route I'm going to be taking with this deck. Instead, I'm just going to accept it and work around it. This is because Kroxa has an Enter the Battlefield ability that also triggers when it attacks. When it does, each opponent discards a card. Then, each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. This means that if an opponent doesn't discard a card at all, then they lose 3 life. Thus, not only is this great for getting each opponent to discard a card, but when they're fresh out of cards, then they're being pinged for 3. Right off the bat, what I'm going to do early game with Kroxa is cast it once, take advantage of that Enter the Battlefield ability, but won't send it to the graveyard. It'll go to the command zone first. This is because it'll be much easier to recast it from there earlier in the game than to cast it from the graveyard for its escape cost, since you have to exile 5 cards. So the second time I cast Kroxa from the command zone, it'll cost 2 generic, 1 black and 1 red, which is still a good deal. Then I'll let Kroxa go to the graveyard. Now it'll cost much less to escape to that than be cast from the command zone. Then, if we are able to escape Kroxa, we can equip it with either Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, or Whisper Soul Cloak in order to not have to escape it again after spot removal. So for the early game, this is how I'll be playing Kroxa. So what's the point of doing this? Well, at its simplest, Kroxa is an amazing discard spell right in the command zone. For only 2 mana, each opponent has to discard a card and potentially lose 3 life. It might get sacrificed afterwards, but black has no shortage of reanimation spells as well as recovery effects. That means that you can potentially do this numerous times. Not only that, but Kroxa is still a 6/6 commander, meaning that it's very possible to win via commander damage. With enough reanimation spells in the graveyard, you'll be able to cast it for its escape cost. Claim to Fame and Unearth are the cheapest ones that will reanimate Kroxa. Since Kroxa has a CMC of 2 mana, these reanimation spells pair amazingly well with it. Goryo's Vengeance, Footsteps of the Goryo, and Stir the Grave do the same thing but aren't as cheap to cast as the previous spells. Due to Kroxa's casting cost, Stir the Grave costs as much as Footsteps of the Goryo to cast. Goryo's Vengeance and Footsteps of the Goryo cause you to sacrifice Kroxa at the end of the turn as a drawback, but Kroxa is going to be sacrificed after entering the battlefield anyways, so that doesn't matter. Apprentice Necromancer and Doom Necromancer are creatures that can do the same, but at the cost of tapping and sacrificing itself, so it might seem slower, but since you have to sacrifice them, they'll be in the graveyard to facilitate escape. Also, the deck has an Aristocrats type feel to it since we're taking advantage of all the death and sacrifice triggers, so these creatures also synergize with the rest of the deck. But we'll see that aspect of it later on. On a similar note, Hell's Caretaker and Whisper Blood Liturgist do the same thing, but they can sacrifice other creatures too instead of just themselves. Whisper requires 2 creatures to be sacrificed instead of 1, but that's the cost of doing it whenever you want, since the Caretaker can only activate during your upkeep. Although technically not a reanimation effect, Feldon of the Third Path fills that role effortlessly in this deck. With Kroxa in the graveyard, we can use Feldon to create a token that's a copy of it, thus giving us its effect at instant speed. What's great about Feldon, Hell's Caretaker, and Whisper is that you can equip Thornbite Staff to them. This allows you to reuse their abilities multiple times when possible since Kroxa dying untaps them. Although Hell's Caretaker is limited to your upkeep, you can still equip the staff to it to continue using its ability before entering your draw step. Further along in the video, I'll give an in-depth explanation on how to abuse the staff with these creatures and the other synergistic cards in the deck. Now that I mentioned the upkeep step, Sheoldred Whispering One also reanimates Kroxa during our upkeep at no extra cost to us. Granted, Sheoldred is a bit hefty at 7 mana, but if we manage to discard her, she can be reanimated too, but I'll get into greater detail on that later on as well. Sheoldred also serves as a way to have opponents sacrifice one of their creatures during their upkeep, which is great. That's also something that will be discussed later on. Strands of Night is an enchantment that lets us reanimate Kroxa. Its activation cost might seem steep since it's double black, 2 life, and sacrificing a swamp to activate, but that puts a swamp in a graveyard for the escape cost. It's also a reusable reanimation effect once we're mana flooded. The deck is running Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth so that we'd be able to sacrifice any land to it. Additionally, the deck is 85% black, so it's important to be able to pay those casting costs. Whip of Erebos is the second enchantment for Reanimation, even though it's also an artifact. We do have to exile Kroxa if it were to leave the battlefield, but since this is Commander, we can send it to the command zone instead as a replacement effect. Not only is a repeatable reanimation effect, but the whip also gives our creatures lifelink. This is good since we lose life to a couple of our own cards in the deck. Cauldron of Souls is the other artifact used to reanimate Kroxa. If you give Kroxa Persist in response to its triggers, it'll return to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it afterwards. It's not really a reanimation effect and would have to be done in response to Kroxa's self-sacrifice trigger, but at least it is a way to double up on its enter the battlefield effect. This can also be accomplished with Mycaius the Unhallowed. Mycaius gives a static undying to all of our non-human creatures, this includes Kroxa. So when Kroxa dies without a +1/+1 counter on it, it returns to the battlefield similarly to what Cauldron of Souls does. With both of these on the battlefield, you would be able to repeat Kroxa's effect thrice. This is because the Persist's -1/-1 counter removes the Undying's +1/+1 counter the first time Kroxa returns, so it returns to the battlefield a second time with a +1/+1 counter. This time when it dies, it doesn't return. But at least you get the effect 3 times. 1 before activating the Cauldron, 2 when it returns with both Persist and Undying, and 3 when it returns just from the Undying. With Panharmonicon on the field, we get to duplicate Kroxa's effect each time it enters the battlefield. It's also not as convoluted as using Cauldron of Souls and/or Mycaius. Panharmonicon also doubles the effect of a couple of creatures in the deck, so it's not a card solely for Kroxa's benefit. If we're able to transform Liliana's Heretical Healer, then we can use her second ability to reanimate Kroxa and still have her around. In this deck, it's incredibly easy to transform Liliana due to all the deaths. If we manage to get her emblem, then it's even crazier. That delayed trigger means we'll be able to reanimate Kroxa at the end of every turn, as well as any other creature of ours that dies. Even her first ability is relevant in the deck, since having everyone discard really puts pressure on opponents' hands. It also provides us with a discard outlet as well, in order to ditch fatties to the graveyard to reanimate later on. Other ways of repeating Kroxa's effect isn't necessarily by reanimating it. We can also just have it return to our hand from the graveyard. Callaghan's Command does just that. However, it also has other modes which we choose depending on the situation, which is great since we can use it for other things just in case. Disturbed Burial and Grim Harvest do just that. What's great about these spells is that we can recover them too. Disturbed Burial has buyback, so for 5 mana we can return Kroxa to our hand as well as Disturbed Burial. That way we can reuse it later on. Grim Harvest returns to our hand if we pay its recover cost. Fortunately, Kroxa is going to die after entering the battlefield, so we will always have the opportunity for that recover cost. Since Kroxa only costs 2 mana to cast, getting it to our hand is a great way to keep abusing its effect for cheap. We can also repeatedly do so with Undertaker. This requires tapping and discarding a card, so it might not be as reusable as some of the other effects in the deck. However, being a discard outlet means that we can discard more expensive creatures to the graveyard in order to reanimate them later, like Sheoldred, which I mentioned earlier on. Phyrexian Reclamation and Tortured Existence are similar effects but on enchantments, which are more difficult to get rid of than creatures. Phyrexian Reclamation requires life as well as mana to activate, but as I have mentioned earlier, Whip of Erebos gives our creatures lifelink, so we can at least balance out these kinds of effects. Tortured Existence requires discarding a creature card to do so, which is more restricting than Undertaker. Fortunately, the deck runs Squeak Goblin Nabob in order to always have a creature to discard to these effects. But Squeak can also be used for reanimation effects, so let's see that in greater detail. A moment ago, I mentioned abusing reanimation effects like those from Felden, Whisper, and Hell's Caretaker. The deck does so by including creatures to take advantage of said effects like the previously mentioned Squeak Goblin Nabob, as well as Endless Cockroaches and Reassembling Skeleton, as ways to provide repeatable sacrifice fodder for Hell's Caretaker and Whisper. Squeak returns to our hand during our upkeep, and Endless Cockroaches returns to our hand when it dies. It might seem expensive to spend 3 mana to keep casting these creatures to reanimate Kroxa, but that's just 1 more mana than Kroxa's casting cost. And Reassembling Skeleton only costs 2 mana to put back onto the battlefield from the graveyard. So let's start with a simple example. Let's say we have Hell's Caretaker equipped with Thornbite Staff on the battlefield, along with Reassembling Skeleton, while Kroxa is in the graveyard. During our upkeep, we can sacrifice the skeleton to Hell's Caretaker in order to reanimate Kroxa. This will trigger the staff, untapping Hell's Caretaker. In response to Kroxa's triggers, you can activate the skeleton to put it back onto the battlefield. Then, after Kroxa's triggers resolve, you can do this all over again. You can also pull this off with Felden. Doing so in response to the beginning of each opponent's first main phase means that they won't be able to keep any card in their hand unless it's an instant or has flash. However, both these effects require mana. Fortunately, the deck runs Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. Not only are these altars good on their own to turn bodies into mana, but you can also sacrifice Kroxa to either of them in response to its triggers in order to at least get mana from it. However, these aren't the only ways to generate mana synergistically. The deck's also running Pitiless Plunderer and Pawn of Ulamog. Whenever a creature dies, they give us ways to generate mana. There are various ways of combining these to gain the infinite mana needed to win by infinitely reanimating Kroxa. Keep in mind that once opponents are free of their hands, Kroxa will hit them 3 life at a time until they die. Let's see one example. Let's say we have Pawn of Ulamog in play with Hell's Caretaker like before. Assuming we have an Eldrazi spawn token from a previous death, we can sacrifice the pawn to reanimate Kroxa. This triggers the staff and untaps Hell's Caretaker. Then Kroxa dying triggers the pawn, which creates another Eldrazi spawn. We can now do it all over again. Keep in mind that this can only be done during our upkeep, but this way it's a 3-card combo for an infinite loop for the win. You can also pull it off by combining Pitiless Plunderer and Pawn of Ulamog. Kroxa's death will get you an Eldrazi spawn and a treasure token. Sacrificing the token for its colorless mana gets you another treasure token. So all in all, you get 3 mana from Kroxa's death with these 2 creatures on the battlefield. This gives you enough mana to pay for Felden's ability if he's equipped with Thornbite Staff. Again, these are just some examples since there are numerous other ways of combining these cards to get infinite mana as well as infinite Kroxa triggers. On the topic of mana, black-red decks don't have as much access to ramp as green decks do. So the decks running Wayfarer's Bauble, Solemn Simulacrum, and Burnished Heart. These artifacts can get us basic lands straight to the battlefield. What's great about the Heart and Simulacrum is that they're also creatures, so their death also triggers all the cards in the deck that care about creatures dying. So not only do they ramp, but they also synergize with the deck. Again, they're also cards that can be used to exile in order to pay for Kroxa's escape cost. Other artifacts that get basic lands in the deck is Sword of the Animist. Since this triggers when a creature attacks, it doesn't matter if it dies in combat or is chump blocked, we get our land. Additionally, it gives +1/+1. So if we're able to escape Kroxa and equip it with the sword, it becomes a 3-turn clock. So there's also that benefit. Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are the other artifacts in the deck for mana acceleration. Keep in mind that Mana Crypt accelerates the deck, but it's not a necessity for the deck to run. So if you don't have one and can't presently acquire one, budget substitutes will do just fine. However, Black Market is the best mana generator in the deck though. It might have a steep cost of 5 mana, but whenever a creature dies, it gets a counter on it. Then we get that same amount of black mana during our pre-combat main phase. This is incredibly helpful since, as mentioned earlier, 85% of the deck is black. Recall also that the deck runs the aforementioned Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, Pitiless Plunderer, and Pawn of Ulamog as sources of mana. These synergize incredibly well with the deck and have the potential of generating explosive amounts of mana, as well as a steady amount of incremental mana. While I'm at it, the deck also runs all 8 fetches in order to have something in the graveyard to exile to escape Kroxa. So at least we're able to fix colors as well, since there are red cards in the deck too. Alright, so how else do we take advantage of Kroxa while also synergizing with the deck? How about by drawing cards? Smothering Abomination will draw us a card whenever we sacrifice a creature. So it's apparent how many cards it'll draw us in a deck like this one. Dark Prophecy isn't limited to just sacrifice triggers. It draws us a card whenever a creature we control dies. Be careful though so it doesn't have a you may clause and we also lose 1 life each time. Keep that in mind, especially when going infinite. We can also draw cards off of death triggers with Liliana Dreadhorde General's triggered ability. Her other abilities are great too since she can give us a body for +1 loyalty. Her -4 has everyone sacrifice 2 creatures, which isn't that big of an issue for us as it might be for opponents. Her ultimate isn't a focus in this deck, but if you're able to activate it without losing Liliana, then go for it. Equipping Skull Clamp to sacrifice fodder beforehand is also a great way to draw cards. We can't equip it to Kroxa each time because equip can only be done as a sorcery, but equipping it to Endless Cockroaches or Reassembling Skeleton is a great way to draw cards, as well as equipping it to the Eldrazi spawn tokens. Speaking of which, the deck is running Bitter Blossom. At the cost of 1 life, this not only provides a token during our upkeep to sacrifice to Hell's Caretaker, but it can also be a chump blocker in a pinch or Skull Clamp fodder. It's also a body to sacrifice to either altars or a body to carry Sword of the Animist. Other ways to take advantage of death triggers is with Butcher of Malakir, Dictate of Erebos, and Grave Pact. Any of these forces opponents to sacrifice a creature whenever one of our creatures die. When combined with Kroxa and the various ways of reanimating it, opponents will reach a point in the game where they'll either have no creatures on the battlefield nor cards in hand. and just in case they have other permanents in play that are a hindrance, we can push the button with Navineral's Disc or All is Dust. These reset the board. Fortunately, if we have Cauldron of Souls and or Machias in play, we can still have an advantage over our opponents afterwards. Zulaport Cutthroat and Stalking Vengeance are more ways to take advantage of death triggers, Kroxa in particular. With the Cutthroat, we can at least gain life when taking life away from our opponents. With Stalking Vengeance, we can take a considerable chunk of life from an opponent every time Kroxa dies. Perforos God of the Forge and Flare of the Hatebound do the opposite. They do damage when creatures enter the battlefield. Thus, there's even more pieces in this deck that work great on their own, but can also get infinite when combined in various ways. However, these not only provide value when combined with Kroxa, but with any other creature as well, since the life loss is on these cards rather than Kroxa. For example, the deck is also running Gravecrawler and a Murderous Redcap. With another zombie in play, we can recur Gravecrawler similarly to how I mentioned with Reassembling Skeleton. So it also makes for great sacrifice fodder to Hell's Caretaker and Whisper. Its 1 toughness means that it's also great to draw us cards off of Skull Clamp. Since the Redcap has Persist, we can use it twice in the same turn. However, with Machias in play, we can use the Redcap along with any sacrifice outlet to deal infinite damage too, since creatures with Persist and Undying can basically never be rid of. The same goes for Gravecrawler. Since Machias is a zombie, you can get infinite enter the battlefield triggers and infinite death triggers with Phyrexian Altar. Sacrificing Gravecrawler to the altar gives us the mana needed to recast it from the graveyard. The deck has only 2 other zombies, but keep in mind that both Lilianas make zombies. Besides all the death antics, the deck also takes full advantage of Kroxa's discarding aspects. Liliana's Caress, Megrim, and Raider's Wake are enchantments that hurt opponents for discarding cards. This maximizes Kroxa's effect. Additionally, the deck runs Fell Spectre for the same reason. Although creatures are easier to get rid of than enchantments, it still provides a body for sacrificing other things previously explained throughout the video. Guess Grimoire is another great card that takes advantage of discarding. This has the potential of drawing us 3 cards every time we use Kroxa. We can also draw cards off of Waste Not, but that depends on what's being discarded. Waste Not is great in that it can also get us mana and or zombie tokens depending on what opponents are discarding. Another way to make players discard cards is with Rankle, Master of Pranks. Not only is Rankle a 3/3 with Flying and Haste for 4 mana, but whenever it hits an opponent we have any combination of modes to choose from. Thanks to Kroxa, you can potentially choose all options in order for you to draw a card as well. Then by either casting Kroxa or reanimating it, your opponents will lose the card they just drew. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running Blood Crypt, Battlelands, Luxury Suite, Sulphurous Springs, Command Tower, and Dragon Skull Summit, as well as 12 swamps and 9 mountains. Again, you don't need to include Battlelands, Mana Crypt, and the more expensive fetches to make the deck work if you're on a budget. You can just as easily use cheaper fetch lands like Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passage, and the like. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. This deck is just hijinxes abound with sacrificing creatures, reanimating them, cheating in fatties, reusing Kroxa over and over, as well as different engines that have multiple ways of going infinite for the immediate win. If that weren't enough, you can also use Kroxa as a valid win con via commander damage. This deck is definitely not a simple one to pilot, but it's still a lot of fun to pilot and play regardless. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.